All right. Thank you all for coming out. It's great to have you all back here for week 2 of our study of the book of Philippians. And if there are folks out there watching, I know that there's a handful of you all. Please know that we're glad to have you here as well. So just kind of a recap a little bit. We're doing this 4-week study, so we're in week 2, and one of the things that we are kind of giving this some structure with is this idea of paradoxes. We are looking each week through a lens, 2 things that are seemingly contradictory and yet held in tension. And if you have not been around Lutherans a lot in your life, they love to hold things in tension. That's a hallmark of their theology. So a really cool kind of lens to look at this book. So last week we looked at the idea of individual community. This week we will be looking at joyful suffering. Free slave will be week 3. And downward ascent is week 4. Let us begin this morning with prayer. God in heaven, author of all things that are and ever will be, thank you for what you have provided for us in all circumstances. Thank you for being present and at work in our lives, even at times when we feel as if you might not be there. Give us the privilege of being living examples of your love. Help us to bring comfort and joy to suffering people near and far, that they might come to know the love of Jesus Christ. Amen. So I'm going to go over a quick review, and then if there are any questions from last week, I want to make sure to get to those. But we talked about the importance of letters in the ancient world. And we talked about the primary purpose of a letter was to convey the writer's authority and maintain the relationship with the recipient of the letter. We said how the letter represented the person. In some of Paul's other letters, he will double down on that he is the author. See what large letters I am writing in my own hand. And again, that idea of this is Paul. I am with you even if I'm not with you physically. And I think that could be an interesting conversation, not one for this class, but about the idea of presence and absence, in the wake of COVID-19 and with all the distancing and families apart. I don't know how many families have started Zoom. My one side of my family has a Zoom happy hour every Thursday. And it's been really interesting. I think it's made our family somewhat closer than we were beforehand, even though we haven't seen each other in person throughout all this time. Another thing that's important to know, the church in Philippi, we think, was founded by Paul sometime between the years of 49 and 52. We said we think that it was formed during his second missionary journey, and again, it's up here, kind of in the in Greece, and it is believed to be the first church established on European soil. Recent scholarship dates Paul's letter to the Philippians sometime around between the years 56 and 57 CE, and they think it's while he was in Ephesus, and they think that he was evidently imprisoned in there, even though we don't have a hard and fast record of that. Again, the reason why we think that is the seeming quicker turnaround. Paul seems to say there is regular communication between him and the church in Philippi. And if he was in Caesarea, where we know he was imprisoned, or in Rome, where we know he was imprisoned, we're not sure that would be as quick of a turnaround, although still possible. So that is our best guess. So if Philippi is here, Ephesus is down here in Turkey. So again, not a short distance, but a reasonable one, much more reasonable than Caesarea down here, or Rome all the way over here. So Last week we discussed the interplay between the individual and the community, and we talked about how the community was everything back then, that everything was centered around being a part of the community, and individuality was really kind of discouraged and repressed. And we talked about how that could be unhealthy, right? And then we also talked about how individualism has really kind of come to the fore here in present times, especially in the United States of America. And individualism, it can be important, but it could also be unhealthy as well. So talking about this idea of how do we balance the individual and the community. And then kind of where we ended last week was this idea of being of the same mind. Paul calls for unity, and yet we discussed, and even in the letter, it's not the idea of agreeing on everything, but working together in love to serve others in Christ. And that's the unity that Paul is seeking, not, and I believe we had the example of, sharing the gospel and doing good works of service versus the color of the carpet in the sanctuary, and kind of that idea, again, of we don't necessarily have to agree on everything, but we got to work together. So that's where we're at. Any questions from last week? Any concerns before we move forward? All righty. Well, let's get going. In front of you, we have discussion questions, and want you to think about a time that you were suffering and yet found joy. Also, if you're willing to think about a time that you suffered and there was no joy involved in that suffering. Would anybody have anything they want to start with?
I thought of my deliveries. They were very hard, very painful deliveries. But there was certainly a joy knowing what was going to come. Holding that baby for the first time.
So
Not the pain.
So there's that childbirth is and interestingly enough, the Gospels and Paul's letters, often use suffering, the suffering of childbirth as a lens to look at, things, that idea again of bringing something into being that is a lot of work, a lot of worry, a lot of preparation, and then, also the joy that goes with it. What else? Anybody else have anything that they can think of that of suffering and suffering without? Yes.
What I thought about was going to funerals, like older relatives or older people you knew in your community, because you're sad to lose that person. You see people you know or your relatives, and a lot of times they would talk about the person. Mostly they talk about the good things, and funny things that happened to them. So, it was kind of both at the same time.
No, I would definitely, thank you for sharing that. I would definitely say funerals, definitely embody this idea, of suffering and joy kind of parallel, and I would almost say that, and these are my bad drawings. So, but I would say almost funerals tend to almost have a braided pattern. Almost like a helix, like almost like DNA, where it'll be, just absolute suffering and no joy, and then, they'll touch, and there'll be that those moments of joy, and then, back to the dark, and then, I think that's a really a really good example. Thank you for sharing. Any others that you can think of? And I'm not picking for anything. I'm just wanted to make sure I'm not cutting anybody off. Any examples where you can think of suffering that had no joy?
This is sort of on the funeral side, but it was, my mother died, this last week when I was 19. I was in the middle of college. I lived at home yet. I commuted. So I still had a younger sister and brother. And therefore, it left me kind of as the mother of the house. I was supposed to know how to cook all the meals now. And missing her terribly. It took a long time before I felt okay about.
No, I think the one you've named, kind of the disruption that death makes into a family system. I mean, as we all have kind of our roles and things like that, and how that pulls. But I think also the way that you phrased that, I mean, when you were 19, I mean, that's an early death, and I do think, going back to Susie's point, I mean, I would imagine most of us have been, present at a funeral where it's a 91-year-old who, has, lived this, amazing life, and, their body is finally given out. And there is a lot of I mean, I think it's easier to find the joy there. Whereas, when you bury a child or you bury a teenager, any of that kind of stuff, or a young mother or a young father, all those things. I think that's a lot harder to find and sometimes I feel like when we try to find the joy in those things for that other person, well, at least now they're in heaven, and they're good, or God just needs all the prettiest flowers. And I'm just like, oh, please don't make God sound like such a selfish jerk, please. So, again, thank you for sharing that. I think that's a powerful example. Any other suffering that does not create joy? I'm going to add a couple, just for. I think it's important to think of things like abuse, poverty, hunger. These things that are inflicted on people, either by individuals or by systems. We are not called, it's somebody that is being abused by a spouse. We are not called to tell them, you should find some joy in that suffering. That's cruel and, contrary to the gospel. So again, thinking about that. So with this idea that joy and suffering are not exclusive, but they aren't always necessarily inclusive, if that makes any sense. So again, this idea that just because you are suffering doesn't mean that you can't be joyful. However, it also doesn't mean if you are suffering, you should be joyful. So, I want, again, holding these things in tension. So today we will be discussing and considering how someone might be able to experience joy and sorrow at the same time, and how suffering might have joyous results. So let's crack open our Bibles to Philippians 1. And we're going to go to Philippians 1:12. Would somebody be willing to take us away? Just the Philippians 1, just verse 12.
I want you to know, beloved, that what has happened to me has actually helped to spread the gospel.
All right, so Paul sets this up. I mean, this is the very beginning. And it sounds like that there's something going on in Paul's life where there's suffering, And he is writing to reassure his congregation, his people, the people he loves and cares about, that while he is suffering, this is still working to advance the gospel. And we know that in many ways, the early church workers, the mothers and fathers of the early church, did have this, this drive where if this advances the gospel, then it is joy for me, which is a little bit sometimes foreign for us and maybe even unhealthy. But I mean, it is an interesting dynamic, and we'll talk a little bit more about the idea of martyrs and how that played out in the early church. So Paul's circumstances, whatever they are right now, is that they are spreading the gospel. Would somebody take the verse 13?
So that it has become known throughout the whole imperial guard and to everyone else that my imprisonment is for Christ.
All right. So a couple interesting things that I want to lift up here, and one of the reasons that some people have thought that Paul is writing from Rome at this point, very near his death, is that he uses the term the imperial guard. Also, sometimes it's the praetorium, the personal bodyguard of the emperor. And what recent scholarship has found, though, is that imperial guard could be applied to the Roman soldiers of any town. So it was not like necessarily, the emperor's royal guard. But it is interesting because it sounds like that Paul's in prison, and one of the things that we want to make sure to highlight, especially in our terms of suffering and joy, is that prison back then was very different than prison now, and similar in some ways. But there was no idea of rehabilitation or reintroduction into society. The purpose of prison was to shame. Purpose of prison was to humiliate, to hurt. And so it was a way to keep potential troublemakers from rousing others to action, which is something that we still use prison for to some degree. It was also a way to extort from prisoners' family or wealthy friends. And this is linked to the third piece that I want to share to you. Prison back then is no attempt was made to provide for the prisoners' basic needs. If their friends and family did not show up, they starved to death. That was the way it worked. And odds are the guards took a cut of that, as they went in. So again, Paul is in a pretty desperate spot here, and he says, his actions, his words have allowed him to preach to his jailers. All right, verse 14 here. Would somebody take us away on verse 14?
And most of the brothers and sisters, having been made confident in the Lord by my imprisonment, dared to speak the word with greater boldness and without fear.
All right, so we hear in this part that that Paul's imprisonment not only has Paul had this opportunity, to preach to the imperial guard, but it has also inspired others who have seen Paul do these things to be more bold in their actions, to be more bold in their witness to Christ. And again, that was something that we saw in the early church with this push of martyrdom, because they were being hunted and killed and all of these things, and it was there are accounts of lines of people being lined up to be executed, to be tortured, all that, and actually people saying, no, let me go first. No, I want to go before this person. And I mean, again, that kind of mindset is baffling, to some degree. What do you do with that? If you are the people in charge, how do you respond to that? How do you take back control? Because they have, effectively taken control from you. And I mean, they're taking a piece from Jesus' rule book, right? You know, or playbook. I shouldn't say rule book. Jesus, when they strike you on one cheek, turn the other. When they ask you to go carry their stuff for you and press you into service for a mile, go with them too. You know, again, take away their power, flip the script. And so that's some of what's going on here. All right, and last but not least, I'm going to read 15 and 16. Some proclaim Christ from envy and rivalry, but others from goodwill. Okay, so there are, despite all these good things that are happening, Paul recognizes that some of these folks are not doing it out of the goodness of their heart. They're doing it for their own benefit. These proclaim Christ out of love, knowing that I have been put here for the defense of the gospel. The others proclaim Christ out of a selfish ambition, not sincerely, but intending to increase my suffering in my imprisonment. Paul says, what does it matter? Just this, that Christ is proclaimed in every way, whether out of false motives or true, and in that I rejoice. So, there is again, an element of Paul's self-sacrificial, hey, if you are doing this good action, out of malice towards me, more power to you. And again, I mean, it's sort of this early church notion of using your opponent's energy against them, almost a judo, kind of. I caught the other day of. I saw somewhere there was a TV up and they were showing one of the old Karate Kids. And Mr. Miyagi is facing down the owner of the other, dojo or studio or whatever. And this guy, he's being a jerk, and he's attacking Mr. Miyagi, but Mr. Miyagi's just moving, and he's bashing his hands through windows, and blood's running down his arms. And again, that idea of using your opponent's energy for good. And so that's something that we see in this text, and we hear in this letter. So discussion question number 2. All right. So thinking about this, who are some modern examples that you can think of that have suffered for their faith? Modern. And we'll use the term martyrs. And again, we are reminded that martyr doesn't necessarily mean that you died. Martyr, the translation is witness. So again, that idea of who are modern witnesses to the gospel. And usually there's an element of sort of suffering or sacrifice or any of that. So any examples that jump into your mind? MLK, Dr. King, yes. And was he perfect? Absolutely not, and yet at the same time he was somebody who was deeply committed, suffered, numerous, imprisonments, beatings, and eventually was killed. And what was driving him was his faith, more so than anything else, definitely his faith. What else? Who else can we think of that were modern witnesses who suffered for their faith?
I think about religious people in communist countries.
Oh, okay.
They try to keep their faith alive, the government they do in an underground way.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate that, and what I really like about that is that there are so many names that we don't know. There are countless folks, in China, in the Middle East, in the communist bloc countries, during when the Steel Curtain came down, and Iron Curtain, whatever. I'm not sure which one it was. Iron Curtain, right? Okay. I was getting ready for the game. I gotta talk the talk now. All right. So yeah, interestingly, one of the things that I remember most clearly from a trip to the Holy Land. 2 years ago, you sent me there for continuing ed, and there we go. Still haven't fixed that. Good reminder, Jim.
Wait 6 months.
Yeah, that's right. That's usually how I fix things. Actually, it's just wait till it goes back to normal. But so when I was there in Jordan, we were working with refugees, and we took a gift to them from you all, and one of the refugees told a story about what was going on with ISIS in northern Iraq at the time, and ISIS would come in. And they would find the Christians' houses, and they would paint a big, giant red N on their houses for Nazarene. And they would give them 24 hours to get out or have the house burned and killed, and them all killed. And instead of leaving, the people would fashion necklaces that had an N on them to say, okay, you're going to mark my house, I'm going to mark myself. And again, just that level of commitment, that level of devotion is hard for me to wrap my mind around. Because part of me is like, wouldn't it be better to live to fight another day? So that, yes, there are countless examples of those folks, where in countries where they are not free to practice their faith. Who else? Modern martyrs.
Nobody was happy for what she was doing, but she suffered because of reaching out and helping poor and sick.
Yeah, she lived, and there are stories about her, taking less food, taking the clothes that nobody else wanted, taking the shoes that were too small, so that others might have, something better. Mother Teresa, definitely I would put her. And I would put her into a very interesting category because, we got a glimpse of her inner spiritual life afterwards through some of the accounts from her confessors. And, she felt God was absent. And there's a level of suffering and persecution there. Whether we know it's not true, and yet, if that's how the person experiences it, that's hard to argue with as far as, what she's doing. Any other thoughts? I just always want to name these things because sometimes we lift up, sort of, the biblical, long time ago people. And I want to always, be mindful that this is still ongoing. I'm going to yeah.
I think even when you're studying Martin Luther King, he sort of did it quietly.
Mm-hmm.
He organized and things, but I don't think he ever saw it. He never had the fame
Mm-hmm.
at the same time. But, he was beaten, he was ridiculed, he was turned away, and he had a very deep faith. His grandfather, I think, was head of the church where he was. But he just, to me, came across as a very humble man that had a deep faith in Christ that made him want to make America the dream that, it was supposed to be for everybody.
That King had, yeah. And if you all haven't had the chance to read the 3-part graphic novel series on John Lewis, it's worth your read. It's called, I believe the first one's called March, and it's a beautiful. It's a quick way to kind of get caught up with the story. Of course, it's not going to cover all the nuances and everything, but thank you.
John Meacham has a book out about him right now too, isn't it? His Truth is Marching On. Or something.
Oh, okay. I'm not. All right. Thank you for that, because I'm not John Meacham stuff. I think he's an interesting character. A couple others I'm going to list up here. let's see here, Bishop Tutu. I'm going to misspell this probably unless I look. Dietrich Bonhoeffer. You know, Tutu obviously with apartheid down in South Africa, and then also beyond that. You know, he's continued working for justice. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, Lutheran pastor and member of the Confessing Church within Nazi Germany, and eventually plotted to try to kill Hitler, which is a whole nother conversation about martyrdom and faith and all of those things. A couple other people. Archbishop Oscar Romero down in El Salvador. Fascinating story. If you haven't read any of his work or any of his story, it's worth reading. Another one from the Lutheran Church. Bishop Medardo Gomez is the bishop down in El Salvador, and during the times, he's a Lutheran bishop, during the times of the Civil War and the persecution, he was very, very active, still remains active. He's still actually the bishop down there. But there's a great story. He did this great public, and I'm going to butcher the story, so I defer to anybody who's watching out there, and I defer to your Google searches later. But they built this public witness. It was a big white cross, and it's probably, we got to see it while we were there. And a friend of mine actually has a replica in his house because it struck him so much. It's about this tall. And on it are the names of the disappeared and the martyrs, down, people that had been taken by the government and killed. And so when they came and hauled Bishop Gomez off to jail, he took the cross with him. The cross went to jail. And they told him they would let him out. He said, but they would let him out, but he had to leave the cross. And he said, no, I stay with the cross. And until they would let the cross and him out of jail. And I was like, what a parable. I mean, what a powerful story to talk about the witness of the gospel. And just for a moment, he was a fascinating. I felt fortunate. I had about 5 minutes one-on-one with him, and got a lot of great insight from him. And I always try, whenever I meet anybody, to try to kind of give them a softball, sort of to humanize. And I asked him, I said, Bishop, what do you do for fun? And I could see the translator, say it to him and then come back. And the translator kind of, I think, knew where I was going, but, it's just who he is. He said, I march. He said, I march for justice. That's what I do for fun. And I was like, again, that idea of, this movement, this direction, this spreading of the gospel brings him joy, even though it's work and suffering and hard. Anybody else before I move us beyond here? All right, two things I want to touch on just before, again, this suffering for the faith. A couple things. I want to make sure that nobody, again, I want to go back and say, suffering for your faith is not domestic violence. Because we've heard that before. Jesus says to forgive, so you have to forgive him. That's not the way it works. Again, poverty, racism, homophobia. Those are not things that we should lift up as righteous suffering. Those are facing systematic evil in our world. Another thing that is not suffering for the faith is sort of the culture wars that have gone on in our own country. If somebody tells you Happy Holidays rather than Merry Christmas, you are not being persecuted. Again, those are I think that is an important piece and it's difficult for us as Americans, and it's also difficult for us, again, as Americans, because we're allowed, we've always had this freedom. It's also difficult as Christians because we have been the majority for so long now. And we have, rather than being marginalized, rather than being oppressed, most of the world, we have a lot of power. We have a lot of money. We have a lot of influence. So again, it's hard sometimes for Christians to translate back into these times, or to see, if you haven't, firsthand had that experience with other countries or other cultures. All right. Would somebody be willing to take us away? Oh, did I miss something? Okay, sorry. I thought Yes, Ms. Andrea.
Statement. It's not necessary to suffer. You could still be serving the Lord in your daily life without suffering. And it's not a mark of a Christian.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's not a scorecard, of something that we, we touched on this a little bit last week in worship with the All Saints Day. We hear the Beatitudes, blessed are the poor in spirit, the hopeless. Again, the idea is not that, Susie's having a really good day, therefore she wants to get closer to Christ, so she makes herself feel hopeless. That's not Jesus. That's not what we're going for. The idea is, though, is on those down days, you are still loved, you are still valued. And to go off of that, again, one of the things that we have run into is sometimes Christians in their twisted view of persecution will go out of their way to be obnoxious and even cruel sometimes, and then when they are condemned for it, they celebrate themselves and say, look, we're being persecuted. I saw some of that out west when I was out there. People, I'm being a jerk and people get mad at me, therefore I'm doing a good job. And I'm like, no, that's not what Jesus is talking about. All right. Anything else before we? Yes, Ms. Susie.
Also, I watch a lot of this, but when I'm flipping through some of the preachers on religious channels, it's almost like if something is going bad in your life, that it's your fault, and that you're not. They don't celebrate suffering. They think you're doing something wrong. You just pay money or buy some water or something.
Yeah. Well, and
that seems. I mean, if they're reading the same Bible as we are, they call themselves doctors. That kind of bothers me because I had a tragedy happen to me that I don't think had anything to do with me being a bad person. And to me, it just doesn't ring true that you have to be rich and have everything go your way, or else you've done something wrong.
No, I think no. Thank you for bringing that up. That's a really important concept that we have equated suffering with punishment, and those are completely different things. Not that if we do something, there might be consequences. Let's say I smoke heavily for 50 years, and I get lung cancer. That's not a punishment from God. That's a consequence, of our actions. Likewise, if we have somebody that somebody gets hurt, there's a terrible illness, I would say that's a consequence too, a consequence of being a human being, and that all of our lives are going to end in death. The best people that I know have, so far, humanity has been 100%, we have a 100% fatality rate. And there is cruelty and evil out there in the world, and no one should be made to feel that when a tragedy occurs that it is somehow their fault. We see it time and time again. I like what you pointed out with some of the televangelists, that if you do good, you get good. If you do bad, you get bad. And I can't go there. It's not found in Scripture, because what's the outcome for Jesus? Jesus gets nailed to a cross and dies horribly. Sure, he's resurrected, but it's not a well, that was fine then. Didn't really hurt that bad. Or Paul ends up being killed. Peter ends up being killed. Tom. All these people are martyred. And many of these folks, suffered horribly. And it's not because they were bad. And many of these people died penniless. And again, they're very faithful. So yes, I really appreciate that. It's not the human condition is not a fair one. Often we see people do horrible things and make terrible choices and never suffer the consequences for their actions. And we see people who have lived exemplary lives who seem to just catch a bad break at every turn. And it's one of the hardest parts about being a Christian, because part of me wants to say, well, what's the good? Why do good if all I'm going to do is get kicked? Or die anyways, And so, again, this idea, I think, of where Paul takes us into this joy of Christ, I think it is going to be important for us, kind of moving to figure out why we do this crazy thing. Anything else before we shift? All right. I want to. Oh man, I'm out of paper, but we'll see how this works out. All right, but I do want to look at another piece of scripture here. Let's stay in Philippians 1, and we're going to start at verse 20. Would somebody be willing to read verse 1:20 through 23?
Eager expectation and hope that I will not be put to shame in any way, that by my speaking all boldness, Christ will be exalted now as always in my body, whether by life or by death. For to me, living is Christ, and dying is gain. If I am to live in the flesh before me, and I do not know which I prefer, I am hard pressed between the two. I desire to depart and be with Christ, for that is far better. But to remain in the flesh is more necessary to me.
Perfect. Thank you. So this is fascinating to me, because what is Paul saying here? What's kind of his argument?
On the one side, if he's living, he's able to keep spreading the gospel and telling others,
Yep.
which is great. With it also wants to be with Christ. Be on that side.
I love.
Really on either side for it.
I love this, because it's not that he doesn't care if he lives or dies. I wonder if it's just that death no longer holds ultimate power. As Americans, I believe, and I'm going to speak directly, as Jim Engel, who is an American, I will speak directly out of that. I believe that death has become something that we avoid at all costs. Whether it is, through medical, through, what we eat, our risks that we take, but it is the ultimate bad. And if we see it with that lens, if we see this idea that death is the worst thing that can happen to you, it does drive us away from finding any joy, or finding kind of that inspiration or drive, as some of these lists of witnesses, and again, I appreciate that Paul doesn't say, yep, kill me now, because I do have some issues with those folks that were jumping line, to become martyrs. I don't know if that's healthy. Again, go back to Mother Teresa. I don't, the part where she was stuffing her feet into too small of shoes. I'm like, maybe you could have done more work if your feet were feeling better, so it's complicated. And yet, if we see death as the ultimate, bad, there's also a dangerous path there. I mean, how many of us have seen loved ones kept alive too long by modern medicine? Because people see death as failure, death as bad, and you see people existing rather than living. And I think that there is a challenge to us in that. Again, that idea of what does it mean to be alive? What does it mean to be dead? And does that all just depend on taking in breath and nourishment and all that, or is there something more to our lives? So how can Paul do this, though? How is this because Paul is such a good guy, and he's so nice, and he's so smart? I'm trying to see where my note was on this one. The idea, and I believe how Paul would phrase this, I'm not sure if it's in this section or in the next, but it's, again, Paul is only able to do this through the power of the gospel. Christ crucified, Christ risen. Again, he has this laser focus, much more so than almost any other, writer in Scripture. He just has this one goal. And in verse 24, we also hear that Paul values that he can be of service to others. And that is his, kind of impetus to keep living, to keep going. And sometimes we see that with folks, too. How many of us have, I'm thinking about my grandfather when he had Lou Gehrig's. One of the things that he asked when he could no longer really move from waist down, he asked his pastor for a list of shut-ins so he could call. And, he wanted to bring them joy, but it also brought him joy, to be able to do something, to still feel connected and to bring joy to someone else. And then verse 26, he says, I'm going to read 25. Since I am convinced of this, I know that I will remain and continue with all of you for your progress and joy in faith, so that I may share abundantly in your boasting in Christ Jesus when I come to you again. Again, he boasts in Christ Jesus. That is the power which sustains. That is the power that drives him. It is not Paul. It is Jesus Christ that is the important thing. And again, I would go back to some of that with what Susie said earlier, and some of the danger of any leadership position becoming a cult of personality. When people say, oh, that's so-and-so's church over there, rather than St. Peter's Lutheran Church, or rather than Calvary Baptist, or whatever. But if they name it as the pastor, whoever the pastor is, I start to get nervous there. And I mean, and I would say, a lot of those televangelist people, they definitely put themselves before Christ, and with some dangerous. And I won't only point at them, because I get up there every Sunday, and I want people to like me. I want people to say good job. I want, I want to be successful, and some of it is because I want to be successful, for the sake of the gospel and all that. But some of it is I want that attention. I want to be told that I'm good, that I'm smart, that I'm wonderful, and that I'm loved. And it's tempting, right? And that's one of the reasons that I do appreciate that the Lutheran Church You know, we move, the church is what is lifted up rather than the pastor. You know, it's not Herb Dubler's church. You know, it's not Bernie Carl's church. It's not Jim Engel's church. It's St. Peter's Lutheran Church. All right, discussion question number 3. All right, we're heading into the home stretch here. We got about 8 minutes left. Thank you all for hanging in there. I was curious, what are some ways that St. Peter's Lutheran and the larger church, doesn't necessarily have to be the Lutheran larger church, but the larger church, respond to people who are suffering? That would have been a really good idea. But I think, let's see here, I want to see if that shows up. If that shows up, yeah, it's good. All right. Got an extreme close-up there, folks. And this way, it will remind me that I need to get a new chart paper this week. So how do we respond to suffering? What are some things that we have done as a church? Either now or in the past or anything like that. World hunger. Oh. The amount of money that I wish sometimes the ELCA was a little more vocal about what they have done in the world. Sometimes I feel like they go the opposite direction sometimes of the televangelists, you know, where they kind of diminish to the point where I'm like, yeah, you need to tell us. You know, I've asked for that. I've said, you know, hey, can you send me a list, you know, every month of 5 things that the church is doing that I can share with my congregation, you know? And so far I haven't gotten that. But or I'm not looking in the right places. But yeah, world hunger. I mean, how many? And it's not just the world. I mean, I know East End Community Center received a grant from the ELCA. I know, you know, Trinity Connellsville has received funds, you know, from the ELCA for programs. So again, yeah, I mean, it's not a global. It is a global thing, but it's also a local thing. How else? How else do we respond to suffering?
Well, collecting things
Mm-hmm. Okay, I want to lift up a couple different things that you said here because you hit a number of important ones. One, I appreciate like the donation drives. You know, that we, you know, we aren't able currently as a congregation to fix everything in the world that's broken. However, there are things that we can do. You know, our faith circle is getting ready to do a food drive, you know, for our local, because food insecurity has come up so strong in the economic challenges of COVID-19. And we've done, we did personal care items for domestic, you know, people who are in women's shelters. You know, we've done the toys for Glade Run, Christmas gifts. And I want to jump to this, is that there are whole agencies that the churches have developed. I mean, you've got Glade Run, you've got, was it Bethel? Bethesda, there we go. Bethesda is a home, I believe it started out as a program for women with young children, I believe. And now that, or was it an orphanage originally?
I've only known it as taking care of kids.
Okay. I can't remember exactly. And the sad part is it was up at our alma mater, Chuck, in Meadville, and I don't have a clear. We did some work with them, but I don't have a clear idea of what they have done. But again, it's an agency that is caring for the most needy among us. LIRS, following World War II, helping to resettle refugees. You've got, let's see here, hospitals, schools. I mean, any number of, I mean, how many of us know the past names of hospitals, by who they were originally founded by, St. Stephen's, this used, of course it's now Mercy General, but it used to be St. Stephen's, from this, Catholic order or whatever, whatever it was. But again, schools, universities, there have been a tremendous investment by churches in the betterment of the world. And then the other one that you touched on was our NA group that meets here. There's a bunch of things that I want to lift up about that, because when I brought that up to council, I was pleasantly surprised, because I have seen this happen in other churches, and there are the only question that was asked was, where will they smoke? That was the only concern. And I have been in other churches that judge addicts and recovering addicts very, very differently and harsher about, well, what if they take something? What if they steal something from us? Or what if they make the place dirty? And I mean, just horrible, horrible things, because, I would gather that all of us know somebody who has struggled with addiction, and they look just like us. They suffer like us, they struggle like us, and we might be in that place someday, that dark alleyway. And so, I really appreciate that we have provided space, and I'm grateful for our NA group. They really they go above and beyond. I get updates all the time about what they're doing, and hey, could we improve this here? And hey, we noticed this was a little awry. Can you tell us what to do? Hey, we were looking for some cleaning products. We wanted to mop the floor. Like, okay, So again, it's been a kind of a mutual beneficial situation. Ooh, yeah. LWR, LDR. And this is, I think, is one of the coolest parts, because how I understand it is often these agencies work with other churches and faith groups very closely. And this is not how it all unfolds, but this was how it was explained to me, and it was just kind of a general helpful explanation, is that when there's a disaster, when there's the earthquake in Haiti, these church groups roll in, and they have a division based on what they're good at, and because they have a relationship with one another. So the Lutherans don't have to roll in and set up housing and blankets and water and food and medical care. No, maybe the Lutherans specialize in the water. Like we have been, kind of that's our jam. And the Presbyterians, they always bring the tents for the housing. Okay, that's done. And the Methodists really do a good job with the organizing of the food distribution and all that. So I really appreciate that they work together, and that they expand our witness in that way.
One of the things that you said, with the other Lutheran World Relief, the Lutheran Agency stays to see things being carried through.
I really appreciate that too, is in some of our, I'm gonna throw one other one up here, that many of our efforts are not short-term. A number of years ago, I think it was 2012, was the ELCA embarked on a major anti-malaria campaign. And it was not a short campaign, and it was not a cheap campaign. And it was that idea of persistence, that when we have big issues take time, and big issues take commitment, and big issues take money. And the Lutherans have been good at that, and many, again, the Presbyterians, the Methodists, many of the Jewish denominations, many, Islamic, there are many faith groups out there doing a lot of good and a lot of hard work. I want to end real quick, just to wrap up. For homework, you have that on your sheet there, but also just to read through Paul's letters to the Philippians again. Again, it's only 4 chapters. It's only like 2.5 pages, depending on the size of your print. Pay attention to this interplay between suffering and joy. And where do you see this interplay displayed in your own community and in your own community of faith? Also, lastly, we always want to put our faith into action. Who is someone you know that is suffering that you could pray for this week, send an encouraging note to, or otherwise care for them? Thank you for coming to Sunday school. Appreciate your time. I'll see you.